Hello and welcome to this special author interview for FanFiAddict. I'm Frasier Armitage, part-time robot, full-time nerd, and joining me today is Tim Hardie. Tim is the fantastic author of the Brotherhood of the Eagle series. He's an SPFBO finalist, and it's great to meet you, Tim. How are you doing today?
Yeah, doing pretty good. Yeah, lovely to be on, Fraser. Thanks.
Oh, it's great. It's absolutely great to see you. And the reason we're talking today is because you have a Kickstarter campaign for an audiobook of Hall of Bones. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that's book one in the Brotherhood of the Eagle series, right?
Yeah, that's right. I've got it here, so I may as well wave it in front of the camera ineffectually just for people to see. But that's the book that the Kickstarter relates to. So it's my debut novel, Hall of Bones. It's the one that got me into the Spiffbo finals, as you kindly mentioned just then as well. Yeah, I'm basically I'm now getting to the end of the series. So that book was my debut, and I've been releasing the books pretty much every year since then. So this year, the final book in this 4-book series will come out with Broken Brotherhood. So it felt like quite a good time with that series nearing completion to actually get back to looking at other formats for the book. Really, and audiobooks is something I've always wanted to do. So so that was kind of the thinking behind it broadly.
Yeah, fantastic. For anybody who is joining us live, welcome to you as well. It's great to have you with us. If you have any questions for Tim, feel free to just post them in the comments, and we'll try and get to them as we have a discussion. I thought the first thing that we could talk about, Tim, is just your love of fantasy, because you've started out as a debut author in the fantasy genre. And what is it about fantasy that just made you sort of like want to write there in that space?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I've got a complete answer to it actually, because I've always read widely. So I think fantasy was definitely part of my diet growing up in terms of choosing books to read. But so was science fiction. So was adventure. Those kind of stories also appealed to me. And if anything, I actually sort of fell out of love of fantasy. So I was sort of there growing up in the sort of 1970s and 1980s. So the 80s was a very big time for sort of, and 70s for fantasy, new fantasy writers that kind of broke the mold of Tolkien. Effectively, is how I describe it. People like Michael Moorcock, in particular, were quite influential to me. But then actually, I sort of got a little bit tired of the fantasy sort of genre as it moved into the 1990s, and I switched very much onto sci-fi thrillers. So people like Ian Rankin, John Grisham were quite a go-to reads for many years, really. But I'd always hankered after writing something in terms of being, I suppose, a creative writer as opposed to just doing it as part of my sort of more mundane day job. And then for me, it was only ever going to be fantasy, if that makes sense. So I think I'd probably describe fantasy as my first love of fiction. So it's not like I don't read other books and other genres now, but if I was going to choose anything to write, it would always be that, if that makes sense. Just anything else, I think would just have. I think I would have. I suppose I wouldn't have had the love of the project, and I think that's the crucial thing. You've really got to love what you write, and I guess that's probably where it comes back to. Those were my first loves when I was learning to read and developing my reading taste, and I think that then came out when I decided to pick the project to write in the first place, really.
Yeah, definitely. And when you were writing it, were you always envisioning it as something that needed to be read, or when it comes to audio? Because I have the feeling like fantasy really lends itself to audiobooks, doesn't it? Why do you think that is?
I think it's probably because fantasy requires it involves the imagination, doesn't it? By definition, you've got to kind of sketch those worlds out in your mind. And I'm a great fan of fantasy on visual media. So I think things like obviously Game of Thrones, but even going back earlier than that, things like Lord of the Rings coming to the big screen. They sort of, I think, may help mainstream fantasy and made it really really accessible for a lot of people and open up people's idea of what could be done with it. But I think with something like audio, the imagination is much more in play. So with visual media, you are a bit more of a passive member of the audience. I think that's why reading works, and I think that's why audio is a natural companion to reading. If you like reading, you'll like audio, and it's basically a way to read without having to crash the car, basically, or other ill-advised things like that. because it just engages the imagination more. And I think that's why people like fantasy. It has that sort of imaginative escapism side to it, where you're much more actively involved in the story. I think more so than other genres, actually. I mean, sci-fi, I think that would equally apply to, but taking thrillers or romance or other genres like that, I think there's just less imagination involved in the storytelling experience. Basically, I probably get derided for saying that now, but we'll just pretend it never happened.
No, I think one of the things for me with listening to fantasy as opposed to reading fantasy is just simple thing like the pronunciation of places and the pronunciation of people and just things. Usually fantasy, you've got all of these sort of like longer named things, and I always read it about 3 or 4 different ways before I settle on one. But just having it the way it's supposed to be heard is a real joy sometimes. Have you found sort of figuring out the correct pronunciations sort of to be fun when it comes to Hall of Bones?
Well, I suppose I've got a pet hate. I have to say where I will get cancelled off this interview. It's clear now. I've got a pet hate when it comes to fantasy names with an apostrophe in the middle or random capitalization and things like that. People go for it. They're creating a fantasy world. That's fine. But one of my go-to things was make it easy to say. So although I take inspiration for it, so my work is a Viking-inspired fantasy series. So it comes with Viking-sounding names. I made sure they were anglicized. And I made sure I removed all the, all the sort of pronunciation elements to them. So in terms of, the alternative vowels and things like that, because I do want my reader to actually not have to work that hard to read the book. First and foremost, I actually set out to entertain. So, I think you asked, before, do I want to be read? Yeah, absolutely. I want to be, people to read my work. And I think every time you make it a little bit tricky for the reader and they stumble, you actually break that magic we were just talking about of the immersive experience of being lost in the story, it seeming real, your imagination's at play. As soon as you've got to figure something out, it becomes much harder. So all my names are very much phonetically, they're written as they're meant to be pronounced, if that makes sense. I probably hashed a few of them up, but hopefully that makes it a bit easier for people to sort of, again, to absorb it. So there will be, if we get to the producing the audiobook, there will be a pronunciation guide just for consistency and those kind of things. But yeah, I suppose you're right. In some ways, when you get somebody interpreting something for the first time, I don't know, would it be awful if you realise I've been reading that wrong for a 5-book series? How would you feel about that, Fraser? I'm not so sure it's a good thing.
Yeah, no, I've had interviews or I've been talking to people about their characters, and I've dared to pronounce their name without checking with them first, and then they've corrected me on it, and I've just been like, oh no, that's awful. I feel awful as a reader but then again, it's part of the magic of fantasy, I guess, is that everybody can interpret it. But with audiobooks, everybody's interpreting the same thing, aren't they? And it's one of the real advantages of putting it in audiobooks. I think it works really well for Hall of Bones because you just have so many characters in it. Has it been a challenge sort of trying to get your head around just all of these different characters and these different viewpoints from the audio side?
Yeah, well, I think it will be a challenge, definitely. So, and I've got RJ Bailey is going to be my narrator, who's done quite a few other fantasy fiction pieces, and he actually was involved in another Kickstarter project I was involved with, which I'll flash the book on screen so I've got it handy and I'm prepared. So he was involved with the Anatomy of Fear. He did the audiobook version of that as well. So I know a bit about RJ's sort of creative template. So what he does is he basically has very brief character portraits of each person. So it'll be things like, are they male or female, for example, their sort of social standing, what's their background, bits of hints of, do they have a northern accent or a southern accent, if you were like, look in the UK, for example, just to get a sense of who that person is. And then he basically produces effectively almost like a sample bit of how that person speaks. Now, this is going to be a bit of a challenge with making Hall of Bones, and eventually hopefully the entire series as well, because there is a very big cast, as you've just said. So, that's effectively, I think named characters wise, we get around 200 across the whole series, which isn't as many as Game of Thrones, I hasten to add. So doesn't mean I'm crazy, but there are a smaller number that I think do need to be distinctive. Others a bit more your named characters that appear briefly to avoid me saying the warrior. hundreds and hundreds of times. So they're some of these things they're more background characters than anything else. But there is quite a big group that will need at least some form of distinctive voice to help you tell the story, or to help RJ tell the story. So yeah, we'd effectively create a library that we then have as a reference point, which would, because the other thing you obviously want is to be consistent with how you pronounce that character. So never mind pronouncing the name right, just how they speak. That's got to be consistent through the book. But then if we come to record book 2 later on, got to be able to go back, and hopefully, ideally, they should sound the same when you continue on as well. So there is actually quite a lot to it in terms of the preparation side. It's not just a case that, if we get funded next week, RJ's recording this the following day, that there's actually quite a big preparation stage we'd have to go into to kind of make this happen.
Yeah, definitely. You mentioned something then that really sort of triggered just sort of a question sort of in my head about the process of audiobook sort of production, because obviously as a writer you're used to working solo. How collaborative is this process of converting it from from the written page into an audio format with a narrator?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. That I think it possibly depends a little bit which narrator you would choose as well, because I think they would all have their own processes. I worked with RJ on the audiobook for The Anatomy of Fear, so I'm kind of familiar with how he does it. But I think there are some common themes in there. The way I look at it is that you are creating something new. So clearly you want them to give you an authentic reading of your work, but it has got to be their reading. So if I went to somebody different to RJ Bale, I get a very different audiobook to the one I get from RJ, and I've got to basically give over a level of control with that. So I've sort of likened this in a couple of interviews. It's a bit like recording, a stage play. So that the words are on the page, but you'll get a different cast one year producing that show. Take the same script, a different cast the following year producing the same show, but in a very, very different way. And it's exactly like that with audiobooks. That obviously we would try and we would agree and get some work down as to those broad pen portraits, the characters like I just mentioned. But ultimately, RJ's got to be the one to record it in that way. He's got to give that interpretation of what he feels is valid. So you kind of get somebody's interpretation of his story, which you get anyway. Actually, whenever anyone reads, that's where you get 1-star reviews or 5-star reviews. Everyone's read the same book, but they've had a totally different reaction to what they've experienced in their head in relation to that. And in a way, audiobook recording and narration is a bit similar to that in that respect.
Yeah, well, I guess because I think when you were on the Dripping Bucket podcast, you were talking with them about how I think you mentioned to Crystal and to Fletch about how long this series has been in your imagination. Was it 2011 that you first started out?
Yeah, well remembered. That's right.
Yeah. So this is a series that's like 13 years in your mind. Is it what's it feel like suddenly sharing sort of almost like the reins, when it comes to putting on this production of this audiobook? Is it giving you all of those like same feelings that you got back in 2011 because you're doing something new with this, or by this point in time it's been with you so long that you're just like, oh yeah, I know what I'm doing with this? What's your feelings about it?
Well, it's a load of different emotions, because I suppose that they are very different projects. So completing a book series, which is what I was talking about before with Broken Brotherhood, it doesn't really feel complete yet. So I think probably fast forward to about September, you'll find a man in a state of crisis somewhere, on a windswept moorland, wondering what to do with the rest of his life. At the moment, because there's still work to do, it's like it feels like there's a sense of completion finishing the draft. But yeah, you're a writer, well, you know what it's like. You've got to go back through that. I know there's still more work to do. So I know it's getting close to being finished, but it's not yet done. So there's all those sort of kind of feels going on. And then going back to Hall of Bones, it's sort of like, it feels like a new project in that respect. So I've got the sense of completion of the series coming to an end and knowing what's happening, but there's also a sense of going back to the beginning and then seeing it afresh through someone's interpretation. And I think that's really what that's why for this project, I was delighted when RJ said he was going to come on board, because I did a lot of the proofing work for The Anatomy of Fear as well, helping to get that book ready for release and publication. And so I'd read In fact, yeah, I think I've read all the stories, and I then did some of the proofing for some of the audio as well. And it was just that for me was the revelation of why I really wanted to make an audiobook version of my series start to come to fruition, because it was just totally different. It was almost like because I proof listened to my own. I didn't recognize the story, and I was getting quite surprised by what was happening, because again, I instead of proofreading it becoming very familiar and blunted to the tale, it had become completely fresh again, really. So yeah, it's a weird mix of like emotions have coming to an end, but then also seeing how that project could find a different form of life or a different form of expression, really, if it comes back round to audio again.
Yeah, that's really good. And that actually answers the question that I'd started asking you and then went off on a random tangent about 10 minutes ago about, did you always envision this as becoming an audiobook? But I guess hearing RJ doing such a good job, that was like the spark for this. Tell us a little bit more about RJ just as a performer, as a, because it is a performance, isn't it? It's an audiobook. It's not just a reading. Tell us a bit more about RJ and his work.
Yeah, I mean, he's done quite a few. So he's kind of, I think RJ's kind of come to prominence sort of in tandem with me emerging as a fantasy author. So from Spiffbo 7 finals, he's done quite a few of my fellow finalists' books. So L.L. McRae, Iron Crown was recorded by RJ Bailey. H.L. Tinsley, her book We Men of Ash and Shadow was also done by him. So trying to think. So I had some familiarity just from the fact he'd done those, he'd worked with them. And about the time he was doing those pieces, we were sort of batting backwards and forwards the idea of me doing it as well. So that kind of emerged about 2022, something like that. So we've been in discussion for this for a couple of years. So RJ kind of came onto my radar as the person I'd want to do it. I think when I did the proofing for the anatomy, that's when I saw the range he could do. So, for example, with I'm not going to ask him to do this, but with Bjorn Larsson's book story in that anthology collection, for example, Hand, it's set in Iceland, and RJ did the whole thing in an Icelandic accent, but different characters with different Icelandic accents, which frankly blew me away. And he did say very clearly he's not doing that for Hall of Bones. I don't want him to do that for Hall of Bones, but what it does do is it demonstrates his range, and I think that's what made me think that's why I want you, because a lot of people can narrate a book. Obviously I could sit down and read my book out to you and record it into a mic and do that, but it would be just one voice for a very long time, and it would be dull, basically. I'm pretty sure, well, I'm pretty certain it would be. With RJ, it's much more about, who's speaking just because you recognize the accent and the voice. And like you say, you're bringing a performance. So he's basically bringing an arsenal of many voices to create a reading experience that brings it to life in a different way. I mean, I guess you can get around that by adding a few so-and-so said this or so-and-so, said that. I guess you could modify the script slightly to sort of draw those things out. It's much better if the reader just instinctively knows it. So, I saw him do that through, my own stories. They just completely different. In fact, he basically rewrote how they sounded. So I knew how they sounded when I wrote it, but by the time I'd listened to it and proofed it a couple of times, they now sound like RJ's performance of them. And I think that's really why, that creative process is what we're trying to sort of like create with the Kickstarter, basically, is to give epic fantasy with the Viking, that Viking feel, that kind of treatment. I just think it's the right project for him. And to be fair, RJ's been on at me for a couple of years because he thinks so as well.
Yeah, that's great. It's great that RJ is passionate about the project too, and that you've not had to strong arm him into it. That's really positive.
No, it'd be really embarrassing if I'd like tricked him somehow into just by social media shame. I drew him in. No, he was. If anything, this was actually RJ's idea, and I will remind him of this as the 30-day campaign takes its toll, basically.
Yeah, fantastic. I think in terms of the fans of Hall of Bones, the ones who've read it, because obviously it did so well with reaching the finals for Spiffbo. So it's got a lot of love in its written form. Hearing that, you can experience it in a new way through RJ is really exciting thing for those fans, isn't it? So, that in itself is just the basic product that this Kickstarter is for. Have you got sort of like a message to those fans, to sort of, encourage them to get on board with the Kickstarter?
Yeah, I mean, I think which message do I want to go with? I'm really passionate about the project, and I really want it to happen. And it will only happen if we get the Kickstarter funded, first of all. So I suppose for fans that want to support my work in a general sense, there's a range of rewards and tiers that you could basically pick to do that. I think if you're a fan of it, if you want to experience it again afresh, I would say this is the project for you. So if you're a particular sort of hardcore, Brotherhood of the Eagle fan, that this is, again, I think this ticks a lot of boxes. The other thing that I wanted to create through this was obviously, the audiobook will be fantastic, and I think that's going to be a great product. But I did want some other new things to come out of this as well. So I am creating a mini short story package, basically something I can get out early, because actually recording an audiobook is going to take several months to do, to proof, to correct, get done, go through that creative process I've just described, and then, get to the point of being in a position to release it. That's all going to take us quite a bit of time. But RJ's very kindly offered to actually do a recording of a set of short stories. So there's like a mini audiobook and a mini ebook short story collection package that you can also get at the lower tiers, or indeed the higher tiers if you want to, which again gives you something new pretty much out the gate. So that will probably come out around June time if we were funded.
Yeah, and this short story collection is called The Roll of the Dice, isn't it? Which
That's
is
right, yes.
Very meta for people who are involved in Kickstarters, because you kind of are rolling the dice on these projects, aren't you? So I think it's brilliantly titled. I think it's great. What can people expect from this little short story collection?
That's a good question. So it's there are combinations. So some of them are simply standalone tales, and some of them are actually the opportunity to delve into some of the characters of the series itself. So I've done a bit of a mix of the two, and they're all standalone. The only connection is the same location keeps popping up. So different people having different encounters at different points in time, but they all sort of pass over or cross a particular location each time. So that was the sort of thread that draws the trio together. So, for example, you get a chance with these stories to see how Etta actually becomes involved in being the advisor to the Riesberg clan, for example, is one. I also had a little bit of fun. So you've got Ulfa's mercenary crew that kind of get drawn into the Brotherhood of the Eagle, but they don't really fit with the sort of high noble Viking sort of characters they're sort of working with, that they're kind of inside the camp and also outside as well. And I always made reference to the number of people that Ulfar had at the beginning, but I never actually properly fleshed out some of his crew didn't make it onto the pages of book one in Hall of Bones. So I actually gave them a little bit of a sort of like, this is how they all started, this is how it looked, and Patrick has just joined that crew at that particular point and is trying to work out who's who and where he fits in that pecking order. So that was quite a fun one to write, actually. In fact, what it's done is it's actually affected how I'm going to write certain elements of Broken Brotherhood now, just to sort of, fully square that circle and draw those strands together.
Oh, that's really exciting to hear. We've got Holly, who's asked which characters asking for a friend who is me. So you must have been psychic in seeing that, Tim, and in already talking a little bit about the characters that are featured in that.
I think I probably answered that one. And then, the other one is, it's actually then entirely different characters. I'm completely unconnected to the main story in Brotherhood, but there are some references there which sort of just point to my standalone novel, A Quiet Vengeance, as well. So again, I've tried to sort of do them as sort of little Easter eggs for people that would like it. If they've read the series, they got a bit of right. But also, if you've not read it, they're a bit of an intro to the world again. But then later on, you'll remember, you'll actually be reading the books with a slightly more informed eye. So it should work whether you've read the book or not, basically.
Fantastic. And thank you for the question, Holly. Great to see you along with us tonight. In terms of Vikings, okay, so where did this love of Vikings start, Tim?
That sounds weird. Is it a love of Viking? This is a weird one because this has never happened before or since. So I did what a lot of writers do. I wrote a sort of awful trunk novel in a classic fantasy medieval setting. They went on a journey, they went through a wood, there was fighting, they didn't all get on. So it kind of, it was all right, but it just wasn't quite hitting the mark. So I think actually looking back, what it was very old fashioned, and I think maybe it came from me dropping out of reading fantasy for a period of time and then coming back into it. So Robin Hobb was the author that she got me back into reading fantasy again, probably around 2005, 2006, something like that. I started picking her up, and a bit late in the day, but her voice sort of drew me back into that genre again, really. And so, but I think my sort of inspiration was kind of going back more to those sort of 70s and 80s novels and stories that I'd read, and it came across in that first book. So I put that aside when I realized it just wasn't quite good enough, and I needed a new project. And I think something in my head, and it was like one of those sort of bolt from the blue things. It was kind of like the tone of Robin Hobb, but just in that Viking setting, just moving it slightly off to one side to give it, I suppose, just a bit more still accessible, because everyone knows what a Viking is, but it just makes it a bit more distinctive. Now, this was back in 2011 when there was no real Viking sort of subgenre of fantasy knocking around. Now, of course, it's a very popular genre. I like to think I was the first person to think about it. I just wasn't the first person to successfully execute it, basically. But it was that setting just felt right. And I can't really, Hrothgar's character came quite quickly, and that was the first character I sort of wrote and sketched out. And it just sort of it just exploded from there. It just became an idea that I was I did plot it, but an awful lot of the time the characters were doing the plotting, and they still do actually. The characters tend to do a lot of the plotting for me and lead me down that particular paths and strands, really.
Yeah, that's great. Vikings they've lent themselves to such a visual flair to them. You've got some artwork connected to this Kickstarter as well, haven't you? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, so it's again working with basically for this project, I reassembled the crew that were working on the Anatomy of Fear. So Dawn Larder, who did the artwork and the cover, I'll show that cover again because I do think it's gorgeous. I must try and point at the camera correctly, but no, failing. There you go. I thought she did a brilliant job on that. And she did all they're probably too small. She did all the interior illustrations in the book as well. So Dawn was a natural pick for me. So with the artwork, we've got with the Brotherhood, and it's actually on the background here on our screen, isn't it, as well? They're very stylized. It's black and white silhouettes. There's deliberately no people on it. Because again, I like people I don't generally, well, for this particular series, I didn't really want the character on the book. Funnily enough, I flipped that completely with A Quiet Vengeance and wanted someone's face on the book looking out at you. But for this set, it was very much let the reader's imagination do the work, just conjure some very, very basic concepts and images and work with that. Dawn's style is very, very different. So she's effectively, a classical illustrator, a sort of natural background. And so for the first time, this is a chance for me to actually sketch out what the characters look like visually and sort of turn my imagination to her interpretation of that. So there's some concept art now knocking around on the Kickstarter campaign. So didn't have this one at launch, but I've now put the concept version of the poster up, which I think for most people that's the finished article. Dawn is still, we'll do an awful lot more work on that if we get funded and turn that into something, a really special piece of art. And she's also done the book cover again at concept stage for a Roll of the Dice as well. So I suppose it just broadened the kind of artwork I'm using, the kind of gives people a bit of an insight into the world, in terms of the setting, the weaponry, the clothing, those kind of things. And we went with a trio. So we went with Hrothgar as he is the protagonist. I guess he's got to be on the poster, hasn't he, really? But then we've got his sister Nuna, who's actually instrumental to the plot of all of this and how it all gets ultimately, from book 1 to book 4. And then we also included Etta, because again, you can't really, Hall of Bones in particular is really that Etta's story in terms of how events move and the role she's playing in that. So yeah, I just love the way she's put that together. And Etta's got her hand on Hrothgar's shoulder, and it's just not quite clear whether that's sort of paternalistic sort of grandmotherly love or possessive, Hrothgar's kind of the person she's using for her own particular ends. And Etta is that kind of character where you don't really quite know whose agenda she's playing to, really.
That's fantastic. And because this artwork of characters has never been present in the series before, this is a really good thing for the fans, isn't it? To be able to see these characters for the first time
Yes.
in that form. I think that's a really lovely thing that you've done for fans of the book. I loved Dawn's concept for the Roll of the Dice cover, which with the curved, it's almost like curved, isn't it? Like you're sort of seeing it through an eye lens, almost like an optical lens.
Yeah,
I thought it
yeah.
was so cleverly done. It looks stunning. Just the concept looks stunning.
Yeah, so it's those horn tankards, isn't it? And they're sort of
Mm.
like, it's that on the so again, that's actually drawn from one of the stories. So A Roll of the Dice is also the short story title for Ulfar's crew. So what you're getting there is a little snapshot into a typical day in the life of them when they were rogues before their rehabilitation, basically.
Similar kind of question to, when you're working with RJ and bringing the characters to life, in an audio format. What's it like bringing the characters to life in a visual format with Dawn? How did you feel about that when you first saw them?
Yeah, it's obviously different because I guess I deliberately went stylistically the other way with the Brotherhood covers. So I had a visual view of what they look like, and they're obviously described in the books. So for me, it was quite important that you didn't look at the poster and then read the book. That they're nothing like that. It was really important that Dawn got what I said they were like, and then sort of translated that. So I think originally Rothko had like ridiculous hair, and it's like he doesn't. If he had ridiculous hair, that would have been mentioned. He has not too dissimilar. It's not as grey, but he has a fairly short haircut, so that kind of came out. Little things like that. But what I particularly enjoyed about it was, nothing was ever too much trouble. For Dawn, I mean, I'll just go on a side quest of my own here for a minute, because we have got actually a book cover package as part of the rewards package for the Kickstarter, where you can actually use Dawn as your artist. So obviously a contribution that will go to the Kickstarter, but a good chunk of that contribution goes to Dawn to do your bespoke, fantasy cover, or frankly any book cover you like, really, because she's got an excellent range. She is just an absolute joy to work with, would be my sort of selling point on that. So we sketched out those concepts again, started very, very light touch, and every time they pinged between us on email, it just got better and better and better and closer and closer and closer. So those incremental improvements. And there was one, so the pre-concept was, I thought it was a really nice poster, but it just wasn't quite right. So Nuna basically looked too old. She's only 15 in the sort of 13 to 15 on that first book, and he doesn't quite capture it. She's beautiful, but she's also young. And so I pinged it back again, and that next iteration it came back, she absolutely nailed that character, and that's kind of what it's like working. It's sort of seeing them gradually resolve from being ideas to being that connection of, yes, you've absolutely got that character now. So Rothgar was the first. Etta came along quite quickly, and then Nuna sort of eventually, all of a sudden, it was sort of nailed on, really. But yeah, it's just basically a to and fro collaborative exercise. And I do like the artwork side, because obviously a lot of writing is by definition solitary, toiling away, on your own, sort of trying to concentrate. But with with things like artwork, recording artists, doing collaborative anthologies, those kind of things, it's a different experience. So I do love that side of it.
What I'm loving hearing is how much work and thought and time you've spent, not on the Kickstarter, but on the products for the Kickstarter, because I think there's an awful lot of authors out there doing Kickstarters, and it is a time suck. But it sounds like you've spent such a long time thinking about the products themselves that's what your passion is. It's not the running of the Kickstarter that you're excited about doing. It's getting to share these things that you've created, and that's really lovely to hear.
I mean, that is the platform, isn't it? Kickstarter is a creative platform to make creative things happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. And the reality is, unless you're prepared to go down the world of AI or audio recording and synthetic voices and those sort of things, which I'm absolutely not prepared to do for all the reasons we talked about at the beginning of this. They're a great expression, but they are an expensive product to produce, because you've got to pay proper professional rate to a professional to do their job, just as I'd expect to be paid for writing a book and putting it out there and selling it. It's exactly the same thing, but it's a huge time commitment for a voice artist to record something like this, again, for all the reasons we just mentioned. So yeah, I think it's, I do think this is just going to be such a good project if we can just get to that 3K target. And without wishing to sound slightly panicky, with 6 days to go, we have still got quite a way to actually close that gap to get to the target we're looking for, really.
Yeah, because you're over halfway funded, which is great, but there's still a long way to go until you get to the 3,000. So for anybody who's out there, who's listening, who wants to support, human artists bringing art into the world, and for fans of Hall of Bones, for fans of Viking fantasy, for fans of RJ and Dawn, and fans of Tim, now's the time, excuse me.
Absolutely, and without wishing to sort of say, now's the time. Now is the time, and I think one of the reasons why now is the time is because I think that there's there is a big psychological element to Kickstarter, which is people, some projects just go bang and they're funded. Some of that's down to author profile, some of that's down to the luck of the draw. Some projects catch and go straight away. Most, I think, do what mine do, which is sort of bob along, and each day is kind of like moving close to the target, but isn't quite. It's still got to get there at the end of the day. If people just see that number going up, so I think a lot of people think, oh my goodness, I can't possibly buy Dawn's art package at £150. I'd love to, but I can't afford it. But buy the £5 package would still, that's still making it happen and still supporting the project. And actually, just those things of seeing the number of supporters and backers going up, and that number just gradually ticking over psychologically, actually just brings more interest. What it also does, of course, is it drives the Kickstarter algorithm, because let's be honest, there is a business behind this from their point of view as well. So Kickstarter wants these things to fund, but they're clearly going to push the things that are funding compared to the things that are not, because that's kind of how it works. So more people that gather around that, the more likely it is that Kickstarter itself will promote the actual product as well. So there's obviously, I'm doing quite a lot of talking to people like you. It's I do enjoy doing it. It's great because I get to talk about the project and things I'm passionate about. But it's also important to actually respect the process you're in. And fantastic to support me on day 30 of the campaign. That's still going to contribute to it. But if you were going to do it on day 30, it'd be much better if you did it on day 26 or 25, because that will encourage somebody else to do it within that window of time. And that's basically the way the process works.
Yeah, definitely. And without sort of looking at how much is left, if you just look at how much support's already been given to the campaign, it's fantastic to see people supporting it and wanting to support it. How do you feel about sort of what has already been pledged towards the campaign? Have you got something to say to everybody who has put in a pledge?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a massive thank you, because for the reason I just explained. By doing that, you've actually made it much more likely this thing you're backing will actually happen, which is brilliant. I have as well tried to, I think, reward people in the here and now, because obviously not every Kickstarter will fund, but I think I have actually made short stories available to people. I've got so that's effectively a reward you can download as a backer just from the updates. So right now there's actually things tangibly you can actually download and enjoy. I've also been doing a little bit of the promo work for Broken Brotherhood as well, which again is really a thank you to say to those sort of fans of the series. I've already done the cover reveal effectively to that select group, and then I'm also going to be doing tomorrow. We've just hit another milestone. We've got £1,750. So that is the next one I sort of announced as the next sort of mini milestone, effectively on the road to 3K, and that's going to be the back cover blurb. So again, chance to sort of see a little bit of a teaser of what Broken Brotherhood's about. So again, these are the kind of exclusive things that people get to see. I suppose that's my immediate thank you. What I'd really like to thank them with is actually producing the thing they backed. So but hopefully that at least encourages them that it was worth their while doing it in the here and now as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's really nice. I want to ask you a little bit more just from an author side of things, because you've spent so long in this world with these characters, and you've written these huge epic books. That's the way that they've kind of come to you, this story. Now all of a sudden you're writing short stories with some of these characters. What's it been like, sort of transitioning from telling these big, wide, expansive stories to suddenly sort of the confines of a short story? Has it been strange for you to be playing in these worlds with short stories?
Yeah, they're very different mediums, definitely. I mean, I actually started writing short stories for my newsletter. So I think, again, how to reward people for, things like subscribing to content from me and news from me. I thought, well, I think what I'm saying is quite interesting because I'm really into it. But, they can be a bit dry, can't they, newsletters and things like that. So I thought, why not throw some storytelling in and make it creative, was the thinking there. So I've probably since about 2021, I started writing this. So what I did in my creative journey was I thought, I know what I'll do. I fancy creative writing. Let's go full epic fantasy. Massive expansive world. We'll draw the map. Let's do a whole continent. Let's not stick it to one country. We'll go full continent, and let's have as many characters as we can name in a drunken long haul somewhere. It turns out doing that is really, really difficult, and I think I probably made my apprenticeship as a writer really hard. What I found when I started writing short fiction was, obviously by definition it's got to be short. You've got to get to the point, and I actually think it made me a better storyteller. Now, I've always had a little bit of the short fiction in me because my chapters are always around 2,000 words or thereabouts. So again, for me, there's a big part of telling the story, get to the point, get to why the chapter's there, finish a chapter, make sure the reader wants to read the next one, don't exhaust them. So there's an element with chapters, of course, which are, in a sense, they're sort of short stories, but they don't always have that defined beginning, middle, and end. With short fiction, you start to really learn that skill a lot more, but then it also, I think, helps you with just your precision editing, all those kind of things. So I think for me, I guess we've kind of lost that a bit with, obviously the older apprenticeships, the 50s to the 70s, it was very much writers would start with short stories and build up their portfolio and then move into, the world of novels, because obviously trad was the only way to do it then. And I think with indie, there's a bit of a temptation. You can just go in and do whatever you want to do, and you can, but I do think short fiction teaches you a lot of things. And I actually now really enjoy the format. So it didn't feel difficult to sort of do short fiction for the campaign. That just felt like a natural go-to. Create something new, get those down, and start building up the tale and building up the world. And that's the other bit that I really like doing is you can't always get, despite probably because we've got too many characters, but you can't always get all those characters' backstories and things into the novel in a way that you really need to. You've got to jettison an awful lot of stuff and just keep the absolute essentials. So short fictions, and it sometimes gives you an opportunity to use a character in a different way, or use some of that backstory you created and actually sort of show to the audience and the readers, again, I suppose the depth of the world building, but also give you a new perspective on those characters. So I enjoy it for all those reasons, really. I think it expands the world and it makes you a better writer too. But they're definitely not easy. I find them easier to write now after sort of 3 or 4 years practice, but at the beginning, very much struggled to kind of get the thing to work, actually.
Yeah, it's great advice for anybody who's starting out writing, where to start. I know I'm the same. I've learned a lot from short story writing. It's really, really helpful.
Yeah.
And what you're saying about all of the words that don't make it to the page, I mean, if you've got like a 100,000, 150,000 word book, something like that, there's probably 1 million words that aren't in there that you've written down about the world. People think, oh, these are long books, but the amount of work that goes into them is amazing. In terms of series writing, what tips have you got for people who sort of have got these big stories to tell over multiple books? Have you found in writing the series that there are things that you've learned that have worked for you in your process?
That's an interesting question. So, Brotherhood of the Eagle is a trilogy in 4 books. So I'm not sure whether you actually want advice from somebody that's lost control of their material to that extent, really. But I think every writer's different. Some will simply go with the flow, they will. But I think you have got to, I think for me, that the key things I was learning as I was trying to close the story down And I found my third book, Lost Gods, I found really, really hard to write, because in that book I was progressing the plot, but I was also putting in the final building blocks to be able to close the plot down in the fourth book. And I knew quite early on in Lost Gods that, you know, this trilogy isn't going to be done in three books. Probably knew that from Sundered Souls, actually, by book 2, that actually it would need a fourth book to kind of complete all the arcs and all the things I'd set in motion. So I think you have to have an eye to the plot and where you're trying to work to is really important. And I think just do not underestimate how hard it is to close down all those characters and all those storylines and all those story arcs in the fourth book. So, you know, spoiler alert, some people will die. That helps actually, because it helps you close down those loose threads. Because you can't. Well, maybe I have. Maybe we get it's a three. You know, maybe it's in 3 chapters when everyone dies, but you know, you can't kill everybody basically. So with those that are left, you've still got to give each of them a satisfactory resolution, because you have that luck with books 1, 2, and 3. It's great fun to kind of go with the flow and say, right, I'm going to chuck an idea's come to me, I'm going to run with that, and a little subplot develops, and you can create. But at some point, you've got to stop, and you've got to rein that impulse in, and start to basically start to narrow those lines down. And I found killing people was awful, and I don't like, you know, some of these characters again. They've been with me for, you know, more than a decade, but actually it was just as hard, if not harder, to actually satisfactorily resolve everyone's, you know. So what I don't want to do is for somebody to get to the end of the book and think, oh, what happened to so and so? And oh God, I've forgotten. Forgotten to write it. I'm terrified of that. So, you know, I have meticulously worked through making sure that every single person gets a resolution of some kind as a result of that. But yeah, that's really plotting is probably the most important thing to remember at that stage, more than any other stage of writing a series, really.
And has it helped you sort of going back to book 1 as you've been writing book 4 to be able to make sure that, you know, all of those threads that you set in motion all those years ago are being resolved? Has that been useful for you, that process?
Yeah, it's in some respects it's more book 3 onwards, really. So on my website I actually have I summarize the plot, because I do appreciate for a lot of people, if you're picking up a book a year, it can be quite hard to get back into the story. So I do organic recap and stuff as much as I feel necessary. But so I think actually writing those summaries was a really good way to remind me what's the core plot. But again, it's the little side characters, because of course some people are quite, you know, people are really into it, and they really want to know what happens to, you know, this really minor character in the book. So I've got some people that are literally they're there and gone in maybe book 1 or 2, but then I still make sure that for the reader's point of view, who's invested time in getting to know these characters and memorize the lists and all those sort of things, they do know the fate of all of those characters that have, you know, been involved in the series up until now.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I really like the little descriptions that you've put, like plot summaries on the website. I was reading through a couple of them today, and it reminded me a little bit of like almost like the fantasy version of a Star Wars scroll, where it's like, oh yeah, this is what has happened, and now you pick up in the next book. It was really, really good.
I've got visions now of animating that in some way and making that a reality. That may be beyond me, but if someone wants to help with that, I'm open to all suggestions.
That would be great. That'd be fantastic. In terms of you know, this particular project and the Kickstarter and the goal of it, with regard to the audiobook, knowing that, you know, this could happen with Kickstarter, has that also had an impact on the way that you've approached the writing of book 4?
Yeah, I think that timing was very important here. So book 4 was written, base draft was written by the beginning of December. And I think what I used the Kickstarter as a little bit of, I was always going to do this, but this was the time to do it. So I think it's really important to take a break in your writing before you go back in and do editing and things like that, because you read what you think you've written, not what you've written, and that's a real weak point for any writer that you need to guard against. And the only way to actually sort of like avoid that is to either completely outsource editing, but not at this point. You need to be still writing it yourself, so you need to provide a bit of a gap between those drafts. So this project was kind of my stopgap. Let's have a break. It turned out to be insanely intense and massively time. I completely underestimated how time consuming it was to set everything up. Just getting all the rewards right, making sure that things like shipping was covered and sorted. Talking through with RJ, some of the how much is it going to cost to record this, working that out, working out how you set the funding goals and things like that. So there was a huge that was a huge surge of preparation, which probably lasted a couple of months. So that was basically December and January. Then there's a quiet period again where actually you're waiting to launch. Now, I deliberately wanted to launch, in March through to April. So I had a time, at that time was sort of deliberate. I then had a window where I edited the book again. So I actually I went back to Broken Brotherhood and did all the work on that to get it sort of second draft over about 6 weeks or so. And that then went out to John Jarrold, who works as my editor as well as my agent. And then that also gave me the opportunity to sort of write the short fiction and so on as well. Once that had gone off and then I pressed launch on the project, basically all writing has stopped. And so it's been a very, very stop-start experience. Running one of these campaigns is actually a real commitment in its own right. Obviously there's taking that time to do stuff like this, which is good fun and I enjoy it. But there's, all the stuff you've got to do in terms of just keeping that. You can't simply launch the campaign and then just see how it does. You have got to literally market your campaign every single day. So I've never marketed something so hard in my entire life, just in terms of it being quite all consuming. And I know that has basically, when I talk about writing, there's all sorts of facets to it, but at the moment, writing creatively simply isn't one of them. It is all about the administration of the Kickstarter and getting, and doing the work that's needed, really.
But I guess this is where all of the hard work that you've put into the preparation for the Kickstarter is kind of allowing you that time to be able to focus on the administrating of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also just reacting to situations. So when funding was a little bit slow in the midpoint, which again is fairly typical in these projects anyway, I did spend some time introducing some new tiers and things. So, for example, things like the cover thing we created, but we talked about earlier on, but also things like doing a bit of an anthology bundle. So I actually got talked to a couple of people that created the Anatomy of Fear, which I always talked about, and also the Advent of Winter. Don McDermott was very kind to sort of say, yes, if you want to use that as a reward, you can do. So we pulled those things into a new package. So you say, because you've done the work already, it's then a case of just simply adding more onto that again, just trying to make the whole project and the whole campaign seem, keep it interesting, keep it fresh as well. I think that's, just because you've launched doesn't mean that's the final version necessarily.
Yeah, that's great. Now, last time I tried to encourage people to go and back your Kickstarter, I ended up sneezing. So it just shows I'm allergic to marketing, Tim. I'm terrible at it. That's
bad news.
But basically, yeah. But what I guess for at this point in our discussion, if anybody's listening to this and if anybody is thinking this sounds like a fantastic project, love the idea of an audiobook, love the idea of some artwork, love the idea of some new stories, love the idea of all of these different tiers and all the work that Tim's done. It will only happen if the pledges come in, won't it? So it's definitely these next 6 days will be a crucial time for everybody listening to this as well as much as for you, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to be honest, I couldn't put it any better than myself, really. It's quite nice for somebody else to be saying it.
Yeah. Well, no, that's the thing. I guess you've done so much marketing. This you'll be on a roll with it. But I'm excited about the Kickstarter. I think it's a really wonderful thing you're doing as an indie author as well, because indie authors don't get the same kind of opportunities when it comes to audiobooks and when it comes to these kinds of things. So seeing you going for it is really it's an inspiring thing. So thank you for doing it.
No, cool. No, I've learned loads doing it, and I think, yes, I want it to fund. I do urgently want it to fund because I put a lot in, and frankly, I want RJ to get the job as well. At the end of the day, the person that probably loses out more than me is actually RJ, because he obviously won't get to record this particular book and add it to his portfolio. But I will say it has been really interesting going through the whole experience. Doing things I've never done before. I've learned so much from doing it. I probably would do another. I thought I'd never say this, but I probably would do another Kickstarter again because I've learned so much from doing this. But particularly, I've learned. I suppose I've learned who my friends are to a certain extent as well, which has been fantastic. Some people have really rallied behind the scenes again to help me with things like creating promotional material and visual material to use for the campaign. It's hard work to produce all of that. One friend of mine, dropped a big bundle into my sort of inbox and said, "Here you go. Think you might be able to make use of these?" And I have made use of those. It's been fantastic. Somebody else has helped me navigating the intricacies of Facebook advertising, which I'm using to sort of supplement the marketing side, which again I'm clueless at. But this person's very kindly sort of actually agreed to run the ads for me effectively, which is great. So loads and loads of people have come forward and really helped actually just together push it over the line. So it has felt like a team effort from all sorts of fronts. Really, it's been great fun.
It's very much a case that we're a writing community.
Yes.
So yeah, it's lovely that you've experienced that. But as a community, let's do it for Tim. Let's do it. It's in terms of if anybody has any kind of questions about the Kickstarter and they wanted to reach out to you or they wanted to ask you, about how the different tiers and what's included and that kind of thing, where can they reach you on your socials and everything?
That's a good question. I wish I had it written down, but I do, so it's all right. So I think if you on the actual Kickstarter platform itself, it might be possible to put like the link to the campaign on this video because it's quite. But it basically, if you search on Kickstarter for Hall of Bones audiobook Kickstarter, you can't go too far wrong. It should come up. If you're finding that difficult though, or want to find the link, or just find out a bit more about me, generally, Tim Hardie author. So Tim Hardie, it's IE rather than Y. Tim Hardie author is a good set of words to put together. So I'm Tim Hardie author on X, Tim Hardie author public on Facebook, Tim Hardie author.bluesky.social on Blue Sky. And if all that's too much to remember, and I don't blame you if it is, timhardieauthor.co.uk is my website. And again, you find all the links to my social media accounts on there as well.
Thanks for that, Tim. I've been chatting with authors now for, I think it was the first conversation I had was way back in January last year, so just over a year. And I've never, ever been able to say there's a link in the description until now. But there is a link in the description. So if you look in the description, there's a Kickstarter thing. So I actually feel like I'm finally on YouTube, for saying like there's a link in the description. Next, I'll be telling people to like and subscribe. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's what's happened to me, Tim. It's terrible.
I don't know. I think the more we've blunder around in the darkness, desperately trying to make things up as we go along, we actually get good at stuff, don't we? I think that's what's happening.
But thank you so much for joining me, Tim. All the best with the rest of the Kickstarter. And thank you, everybody who's listening in as well. And thank you, Holly, for your question, which was lovely. And thank you to everybody. And all the best with it, Tim.
Yeah, thanks, Fraser. It's been brilliant to be on. Thanks very much.